Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Miss Marple and the Coded Letters Secret, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Miss Marplet. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The Letter That Arrived After the Funeral. A mysterious envelope sealed in wax and coded arrives too late to save a life. It was the kind of rain that clung to the air like grief, persistent grey, and too quiet. The village of Fallow Bridge was wrapped in a wet hush as the last of the mourners drifted away from the chapel steps, their umbrellas bobbing like black beetles against the stone path. Miss Jane Marple stood a little apart from them, the tip of her umbrella resting precisely against the cobbled lane, her gloved hands folded neatly over the handle. She hadn't known Miss Lucinda Armitage well, only from garden parties and charity raffles, but even the briefest acquaintance could rattle her curiosity when the circumstances reeked of something unsaid. Lucinda had died in her bed 2 nights ago. Natural causes, the doctor said. Heart simply gave out, he'd explained with a weary sort of finality, the kind country doctors used when they preferred not to disturb the waters of polite grief. But Miss Marple had seen too many hearts give out, under circumstances that suggested a more deliberate hand. She was about to turn toward the vicarage for a brief word with Reverend Mallory, who had seemed rather anxious throughout the service, when the village postboy, drenched to the bone and shivering, came rushing across the square. He stumbled up the chapel steps, clutching a single envelope high above his head as though afraid it might dissolve in the rain. "Is it for the vicar?" someone called. The boy shook his head. "It's for Miss Armitage. It's marked urgent, but I didn't get it till this morning. It came up from London on the early train." There was a pause, the kind that falls when the dead are addressed too late. The vicar gently took the envelope from the boy's hand, frowning at the heavy cream stock, the wax seal, deep red and marked with an unfamiliar crest, and the careful, deliberate script. He turned it over, as if half expecting the contents to vanish. "Extraordinary," he murmured, then glanced toward Miss Marple. It was instinctual, really. People had a way of doing that, of turning to her at moments when something didn't quite fit. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "I don't believe Miss Armitage had any family left alive," she said softly. "And I cannot recall her ever corresponding regularly with anyone outside the village." The vicar hesitated, then gestured toward the vestry. "Perhaps, Miss Marple, you might assist in reviewing its contents. I hardly think it would be appropriate for the postman or myself to—" But Miss Marple was already moving. Delicacy and propriety might dictate restraint, but wisdom and experience had taught her that delay could mean lost truths. In the quiet vestry, with its worn velvet chairs and oil portrait of some long-dead bishop glaring disapprovingly over their shoulders, the vicar broke the seal, unfolded the thick parchment. There were 2 sheets. The first was a letter written in tight, slanted handwriting, dated 3 days prior, the night Miss Armitage died. The paper smelled faintly of pipe smoke and violet water, and the ink was darker than one would expect, as if the writer had pressed hard in haste or fear. "My dearest Lucinda," it began, "I fear I have delayed too long. You must leave Armitage House tonight. The danger is closer than even I suspected. Do not trust anyone, especially not those who offer sympathy. They know. The ledger was never destroyed. You must take it to Miss M. She will know what to do. Burn this letter after reading it. I am sorry for everything." There was no signature, only a small, strange mark in the bottom corner, a triangle with a line drawn through it. Miss Marple read the letter twice. Then she lifted the second page, which had been folded within the first. It was a cipher, clearly a code, but of what sort she could not yet say. Dots and dashes looping strokes that resembled musical notation, and occasional foreign phrases, as if someone had mixed Latin with French in a fevered scramble. She tapped the paper lightly. "This letter was meant to be a warning," she said, "but it arrived too late. That I find suspicious. Lucinda received no telegrams, no telephone calls, and yet someone clearly believed she was in danger." "But who is Miss M?" the vicar asked. "Could it be?" "I rather think it was meant for me, Miss," Marple said calmly. Lucinda knew I was fond of puzzles, and she had already noticed a curious thing. The writer's hand had been disguised, but not entirely. There was a particular way the lower loops of the G's stretched, a characteristic she had once seen in letters written by Colonel George Everley, a man thought dead these past 7 years, whose disappearance had caused quite the quiet scandal. Rumours had abounded: embezzlement, treason, a failed affair with someone high in the government, but nothing had ever been proved. Miss Marple at the time had merely noted that a man as meticulous as Everley did not vanish without packing his cufflinks. She folded the letter gently, handed it back to the vicar, and said, "I believe I should pay a call to Armitage House." The manor stood just beyond the edge of the village, its gables sharp against the grey sky, the windows weeping streaks of rain down their glass. Inside, the house was still, draped in white sheets and mourning silence. Only one servant remained, a housekeeper, Mrs. Dunsley, a small woman with stiff hands and a stiff mouth, who met Miss Marple at the door with an expression carved from marble. "I expect you'll want to poke about," she said. "They all do in the end." Miss Marple didn't flinch. Lucinda was a kind woman. She deserved better than to die frightened. Mrs. Dunsley's mouth twitched, but she didn't reply. Instead, she led Miss Marple to the drawing-room, where the fire had long since gone cold. On the mantel was a small framed photograph of a much younger Lucinda, laughing, her arm wrapped around a man whose face had been scratched out. Not removed, scratched, with a blade or perhaps a pin. Miss Marple picked it up. "Did she often receive letters?" she asked. "Only once a year," Mrs. Dunsley replied. "On her birthday, always with a pressed violet inside. She never spoke of who sent them, but I believe he was the reason she never married." "She kept a ledger," Miss Marple said casually, watching for any flicker. There was one, small but undeniable. Mrs. Dunsley's hands paused on the edge of a doily. "She kept many things," the woman said at last, "but if you're suggesting someone killed her over an old book, well, that's nonsense." "I never mentioned murder," Miss Marple said gently. Outside, thunder rolled low over the hills. Miss Marple took her leave not long after, but not before slipping the scratched photograph into her handbag. She had already decided she would visit Mr. Sedgwick, the solicitor who had handled Lucinda's affairs for over 20 years. There was something off about the timing of the will's reading, scheduled a week from now, far later than usual. That delay, paired with the late arriving letter, prickled at her instincts. But before she reached the lane, someone called her name. She turned to see Reverend Mallory hurrying down the walk, his coat flapping behind him like a raven's wings. In his hand, he held a small box. "This was delivered to the Ye Church office just now," he said breathlessly. "It's addressed to you." Miss Marple took the parcel. It was wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine, and sealed with wax. Again that same crest. A triangle crossed by a single line. Inside was a smaller envelope, and within it, only 2 things. A brass key, old and ornate, with the number 3 engraved faintly along its side, and a torn scrap of paper with a single line scrawled in ink. What she buried was not what they think. Miss Marple's breath caught ever so slightly. The cemetery. Lucinda had requested burial beside her father, but there had been whispers, odd ones, about the quickness of the funeral, the heavy weight of the coffin, the way it had been sealed before even the doctor arrived. She folded the paper carefully, tucking it into her pocket. Something had been hidden, and someone, somewhere, still thought Miss Marple might be too late to stop what was coming. But they were wrong. She was just in time. And as the rain fell, harder, she turned toward Armitage Cemetery with the brass key in her hand and the name of Colonel George Everleigh forming silently on her lips. Is this helpful so far? Chapter 2. The room no one could have left. The victim was found alone in a locked study, but the window had never opened in years. The wind howled around Armitage House that night, rattling the bare trees like skeletal fingers tapping at locked panes. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the hallway where the corridor bent sharply outside the study door, her gloved hands folded as neatly as her thoughts. She hadn't expected to return to the house so soon, not after Lucinda's funeral and the mystery of the wax-sealed letter, but something in her bones had whispered there would be more. Something unresolved, and now it was dreadfully clear that the storm had not passed. It had only begun. It was the housekeeper's scream that summoned the household. Mrs. Dunsley had gone to bring tea to Mr. Edwin Hallam, Lucinda's solicitor and estate executor, who had arrived earlier that afternoon to examine the ledgers Lucinda had left behind, if indeed any still existed. He had retired to the study, asked not to be disturbed, and locked the door behind him, saying he had delicate matters to attend to. Now he lay sprawled in the high-backed leather chair beside the cold fireplace, his head lolling grotesquely to one side, eyes wide open and glassy. A deep purple tinge bloomed across his jaw, and the teacup he'd been holding lay shattered at his feet. The heavy door remained locked from the inside. The only key was in his pocket. The window behind him, large and ornate, was shut tight, the rusted latch so corroded it hadn't moved in years. Even the curtains were untouched. The hearth was cold, the ash undisturbed, and no other exit marred the study's symmetrical design. "There's no way out," muttered Inspector Caldwell grimly, stooping near the body. "The man's been poisoned. That much seems sure. But how in God's name did the killer get in? Or out?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Her eyes had swept the room from the threshold, noting the neat placement of books on the shelves, the absence of footprints on the worn rug, the faint scent of something chemical, not floral, not sweet, something acrid. Like almonds, she thought, but not quite. Caldwell rose and turned to her. "You knew him, didn't you, Hallam?" "Only by reputation," she said mildly. "He was Lucinda's solicitor. Quiet man, cautious, not particularly imaginative, but diligent. He had a fondness for chess, if I recall." "Chess?" "Yes," she said softly. "The kind of man who always thought 6 moves. Ahead. That makes him rather difficult to surprise. Or to trap." Caldwell gestured toward the desk. "Everything appears untouched. No signs of forced entry, nothing disturbed. The door was bolted from the inside. The only key was in his waistcoat pocket. And the window? Hasn't opened in years, according to the housekeeper," he said. "Corroded shut. And the ivy's grown over it from the outside. No one's climbed through." Miss Marple took a step forward and bent beside the small side table, next to the dead man's chair. The tray was perfectly arranged, china cup, silver spoon, a single biscuit, untouched. She lifted the spoon with a handkerchief. No residue. Her gaze drifted to the teacup shards on the floor. "He dropped it, not flung it," she said. "See how the handle is still close to the base. That suggests it slipped as he fell. No violence, no struggle." "And the poison?" Caldwell asked. "I believe," said Miss Marple, rising, "that it was administered by Hallam himself, but not willingly." Caldwell frowned. "You think he was tricked into drinking it?" Miss Marple nodded, walking slowly to the desk. She opened a drawer with care, pens, paper, stamps, and a note scrawled hastily, barely legible. "It's not here," she lied. "Must have destroyed it after all." She held it up. Hallam was searching for something Lucinda supposedly left behind. A ledger. He believed it existed. Someone must have convinced him otherwise, just before he died. Caldwell took the note. So, what's your theory? He was handed a poisoned drink. But by whom? No one else went in. Miss Marple's expression didn't waver. There are poisons that take effect gradually, or those that are activated by something else. Heat, milk, lemon. Perhaps the tea was safe, until he added something to it. She stepped to the mantel, eyeing the silver box that held sugar cubes. Inside, one of them was a slightly different shade, only just, to an untrained eye indistinguishable, but not to her. She folded the lid, gently closed. I believe he was meant to die precisely in this way, locked inside, no visible murderer, nothing to connect anyone to the scene. It's a clever illusion. But illusions always have flaws. Caldwell exhaled. What are you suggesting? That Mr. Hallam trusted someone, she said. Someone who knew his habits, who knew he always sweetened his tea with 2 cubes from that box. Someone who left before he poured the cup. Because all that was needed was time. The study was growing colder. Now the fire unlit and the air heavy with unasked questions. Miss Marple stepped back into the hall, where the servants and guests had gathered, whispering behind handkerchiefs and shawls. Among them was young Edith Vale, Lucinda's distant niece, a clever-eyed girl of 20 with a pale face and a guarded mouth. And just beside her stood Arthur Bramwell, Lucinda's cousin, a portly pink-faced man with too much cologne and too little patience. Edith looked up sharply as Miss Marple passed. Is it true, Mr. Hallam? He's dead? I'm afraid so, Miss Marple said gently. Poisoned, it seems. Edith's fingers tightened on her sleeve. But that's not possible. No one saw anyone go in. We were all in the drawing room after dinner. Mr. Hallam said he needed quiet to go through Aunt Lucinda's documents. He locked the door himself. Did he take tea with him? No, said Edith. Mrs. Dunsley brought it later. I saw her carry the tray. That was curious. Hallam had been dead barely half an hour before the body was discovered, meaning the tea had only just been served. Mrs. Dunsley reappeared at that moment, her expression tight with disapproval. I did as I always do, left the tray outside the door. Mr. Hallam didn't want to be disturbed. He unlocked the door just enough to take the tray, then shut it again. And you're sure no one else touched it? Miss Marple asked. Positive. I brought it from the kitchen myself. Miss Marple turned to Edith again. Did you ever hear Lucinda mention the ledger? Or any instructions she left behind? Edith hesitated. She said strange things the week before she died. That something old was about to surface, that secrets didn't stay buried forever. I thought she was being poetic. And did she trust Mr. Hallam? A pause. She said he was reliable, Edith admitted, but she never told him everything. Aunt Lucinda had a way of keeping the sharpest truths locked away, especially when they involved the family. Miss Marple gave a small nod, thoughtful. Bramwell shifted beside Edith, clearing his throat. If you ask me, he said, Lucinda brought this on herself. She never trusted anyone, never let go of old grievances. If there's a ledger, it's probably filled with half-baked accusations and gossip. Gossip, Miss Marple said lightly, is the beginning of most truths, though rarely the end. She moved back toward the study, her eyes drawn once more to the photograph above the mantel. The same one from the drawing room, Lucinda, young, smiling, beside the faceless man whose image had been scratched out. Why would someone remove his identity but keep the photo? It was not an erasure. It was a reminder. A wound preserved. She turned to Caldwell. Do we know who this man was? He shook his head. No name on the back. And no relatives have claimed the estate beyond Bramwell and Miss Vale. Then perhaps, she said quietly, this man is the root of it all. Caldwell looked confused. Miss Marple added, he may have known something about Lucinda's past. Something she feared being exposed. or something Hallam had recently discovered. Enough to be worth a warning, and a murder. She glanced toward the hearth. There was no ash on the grate, but a faint mark on the edge of the brass fender, a thin streak of soot drawn as though someone had picked up something that had once rested there. A poker, perhaps, or a letter. She turned back to the desk. In the lower drawer, hidden beneath a stack of old legal pads, she found a charred scrap of paper. Most had been burnt away, but one edge remained legible. Find the truth in the room behind the red door. She never burned it. Miss Marple's lips parted slightly. There was no red door in the house as far as she recalled, but then again, Armitage House had 3 floors, and not all were open to guests. She folded the fragment into her glove and turned toward the staircase, her mind already whirring. The study may have been locked, but perhaps the answers were hidden, somewhere that hadn't been locked at all. And if the killer believed their trick with the tea had left no trail, they hadn't yet reckoned with Miss Marple. Chapter 3. The Last Person to See Him Alive. A quiet maid remembers a small detail, but is it too insignificant to matter? The morning after the locked room death of Edwin Hallam dawned grey and soaked in drizzle, as if the sky itself regretted the murder. Armitage House loomed against the mist like a brooding stone relic, its windows dark, the ivy crawling a little higher with each passing day. Miss Marple sat in the withdrawing room, hands folded over her knitting bag, though she had not touched a needle since she arrived. Her thoughts were too occupied by keys, sugar cubes, and now a question that wouldn't stop echoing. Who had spoken to Hallam last? Inspector Caldwell had returned at first light, bringing with him a fresh batch of questions and a growing sense of irritation. There were no fingerprints of value, no misplaced items, no sign of forced entry. Everything pointed to poison, and yet no one had seen it delivered. "We're missing something," he muttered for the 5th time, pacing by the fireplace. No one admits to being in that corridor near the study. The tea was delivered after Hallam was already locked in. So who handed him the fatal dose? Miss Marple didn't answer directly. She had learned that silence often drew out truths better than questions. And sure enough, footsteps soon sounded outside the drawing room, followed by a timid knock. It was the maid, young Maisie, barely more than 16, with soft hands and a voice like crumpled paper. She stood in the doorway, twisting the hem of her apron, eyes wide with a sort of reluctant burden. I thought I ought to say something," she whispered. "About Mr. Hallam." Caldwell straightened. "Go on, girl." Maisie looked down. "I saw him. Last night, just before he locked himself in." Miss Marple's eyes lifted, sharp and focused. "Did you speak with him?" "No, miss. I was just bringing up a tray to the 2nd floor, some lemon water for Miss Vale. I passed Mr. Hallam on the landing. He was coming down, carrying some papers. Looked cross, muttering to himself." "What time was this?" Caldwell asked. "Just before 8, sir. I remember because I heard the grandfather clock chime as I turned down the hall." "And what exactly was he muttering?" Maisie swallowed. "Something like, 'She lied to me again.' Of course she did. And then he said, 'Always one step ahead, even dead.'" There was a silence. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Maisie, you said he was carrying papers. Did you see what they were?" The girl hesitated. "Only a bit. Old, yellowish. Looked like they'd been kept somewhere a long time. One had a red corner on it, like wax, but broken. He was holding them tight." "And where was he going?" "Down to the study, miss. I saw him go in, and then he locked the door." Miss Marple turned to Caldwell. "This confirms he found something upstairs, perhaps in Lucinda's rooms. Documents, maybe part of the ledger, or letters. Something worth dying over." Maisie added hesitantly, "There's another thing. I wasn't going to say because it's not proper, but when I passed Miss Vale's door, it wasn't shut all the way. I saw her sitting there, crying, holding a photograph." Miss Marple stood. "Did the photograph look like the one on the mantelpiece, Maisie blinked. Yes, miss, but hers wasn't scratched. Now that was interesting. Miss Marple left Maisie with a soft word of thanks and turned toward the stairs. She found Edith Vale in her room, pale and withdrawn, the curtains half drawn against the grey light. The photograph lay face down on the writing desk, but Miss Marple lifted it without asking permission. Lucinda again, younger, laughing, and beside her, not a faceless blur but a handsome man in military uniform, smiling in profile. You kept the original, Miss Marple said softly. The one Lucinda never wanted others to see. Edith didn't speak. He was the man she loved, wasn't he? Miss Marple continued. The one who disappeared. Colonel George Everley. Presumed dead but never confirmed. Edith turned her head slowly. He was my father. That silenced even Miss Marple for a moment. My mother, Edith said, her voice flat, was Lucinda's sister. She died when I was a baby. Aunt Lucinda took me in, but she never spoke of my father. Never let me ask. I found this photo in her desk a year ago. I've kept it since. I wanted to believe he might still be alive. Miss Marple lowered the photo gently. He may be. Or he may be the reason Lucinda hid so much. Do you think Hallam found something about him? Last night. I do, Miss Marple said. And I think he was killed for it. She paused. Tell me, Edith, did Lucinda ever mention a red door? Edith blinked. Yes. Once. A long time ago. I was just a child. She said the truth was always behind the red door. I thought she meant it as a warning. She never said it again. Miss Marple nodded, the scrap of charred paper in her glove, pressing like a pulse. The red door, the key marked with a 3. And now Hallam, who had gone upstairs and returned with documents that likely led him to the truth, and to his death. She descended the stairs with calm precision, finding Caldwell again in the study. She told him all of it, Maisie's account, the photo, the mention of Colonel Everley, and watched his face grow increasingly tight. I remember that name, he said. The Everley case was a mess. Disappeared from a military post with classified documents, rumoured to have turned traitor, then vanished without a trace. Miss Marple gave him a long look. What if he didn't vanish? What if Lucinda hid him or helped him disappear? Caldwell exhaled. Then someone might kill to keep that secret buried. I believe someone already has. She requested access to the 3rd floor. Bramwell tried to protest. It was unused, dusty, full of old trunks and moths, he claimed, but Caldwell overruled him. Together they climbed the creaking stairs to the attic level, where faded wallpaper peeled from the corners, and the air smelled faintly of mothballs and cedar. At the end of the corridor was a single painted door, flaking but unmistakably red. Miss Marple took out the brass key. It slid in smoothly. Inside was a small, cramped room with a slanted roof and a single round window, a writing desk, a narrow bed, and in the corner, a tall cabinet sealed with a rusted lock. The desk drawers contained letters, hundreds, bundled with ribbon, all from George Everley, many addressed to Lucinda, some to someone else. A name Miss Marple had not yet heard, to Monsieur Vale. In the event I am gone. Miss Marple unfolded one of them. The ink was neat, the tone panicked. The last one, dated 10 years ago, included the words, "The ledger is false. They forged it. If it comes to light, they'll silence anyone who speaks. You must tell Edith the truth. She has the right to know." Miss Marple looked up at Caldwell. This was never about inheritance, she said. This was about reputation, legacy. Edith was born under a cloud of betrayal, but it was a cloud built on lies. If Everley was innocent, then the ledger is evidence of a conspiracy, and someone is willing to kill to keep that conspiracy buried. Caldwell moved to the cabinet. He forced the lock with a metal rod and swung the door open. Inside, carefully preserved, was the missing ledger, and beside it, an envelope addressed in Lucinda's handwriting. to be given to Edith, upon my death. No sooner. Miss Marple took it with reverence. Downstairs, Maisie waited, nervously in the hall. When she saw them emerge, she blurted, "Miss Marple, I just remembered something else. It's silly, but when I passed the study after Mr. Hallam went in, I thought I heard humming. Just for a moment, a woman's voice. But when I listened again, it was gone." Miss Marple's eyes met Caldwell's. "That," she said, "is not silly. That, Inspector, is the beginning of the next lie unravelling. And somewhere in the house, someone who had thought themselves safe had just been heard." Chapter 4. The Will That Was Never Meant to Exist. An unsigned version surfaces, favouring someone entirely unexpected. The rain had turned to sleet by the time Miss Marple returned to Armitage House that evening, her sensible boots crunching over gravel, slick with half-melted ice. The lamps along the lane glowed dimly through the fog, and the house itself stood dark but watchful, as if holding its breath. Inside, the air was thick with unresolved tension. The death of Mr. Hallam had cast a long shadow, but it was the silence in the drawing room that told Miss Marple something new had disturbed the equilibrium. She found Inspector Caldwell standing stiffly near the hearth, the ever-nervous Bramwell seated in an armchair with a glass of brandy clutched between his hands. Edith Vale stood near the window, arms crossed, face unreadable. In the centre of the table lay a single sheet of heavy paper, its corners slightly curled from the damp air, and beside it, an envelope bearing the seal of the Armitage family crest, though the seal was cracked. No one spoke as Miss Marple approached. It was Caldwell who finally said, "We've just received a most interesting document." A second will. Miss Marple arched an eyebrow, calm despite the implications. "Another version?" "Unsigned," Caldwell confirmed, "but entirely legible, and very different from the one Hallam read out last month." Miss Marple lifted the sheet and read quickly. The contents were clear. Lucinda Armitage had apparently intended to leave the majority of her estate not to her cousin Bramwell, as previously assumed, but to her niece Edith, with specific provisions for one Maisie Dalton, the young maid. There were also donations earmarked for 2 obscure charities, both located in Cornwall. "Maisie," Miss Marple looked up. "And where was this found?" "In Hallam's briefcase," Caldwell said, "tucked between files, as if it had been slipped in hurriedly. No signature, no date, but the handwriting is clearly Lucinda's." Bramwell leapt up. "This is absurd. She never mentioned altering her will. I spoke with her only a week before her death. She said nothing of this." Miss Marple didn't reply. She studied the will again, her eyes narrowing on the margins. There, barely noticeable, was a faint smudge of what appeared to be wax. Dark red, not black, like the official seal, as if someone had attempted to seal the document, but never completed the process. Edith spoke quietly. "She told me once that she was planning to make things right, that there were people she'd overlooked. I thought she meant old acquaintances or charities. I never imagined—" "She never meant this to be legal," Bramwell snapped. "That's why it wasn't signed. This was a draft, nothing more, and now Hallam is dead and the original stands." Miss Marple said nothing. She was thinking of the room with the red door, of the hidden letters and the ledger, now safely in Inspector Caldwell's possession. She was also thinking of Lucinda, methodical, proud but not cruel. If she had truly intended to change her will, she would have signed it, unless she had been prevented. "Maisie," Miss Marple said gently, "might you come here a moment?" The maid entered hesitantly, eyes wide. "Yes, miss." "You knew Miss Armitage well," Miss Marple continued. "Did she ever mention making a new will? Or speak of her intentions for after her death?" Maisie bit her lip. "She said she'd written something new, told me to keep an envelope safe in case anything happened. But then she changed her mind. Told me she'd decided to deliver it to Mr. Hallam herself. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Do you still have that envelope? Maisie hesitated. No, miss. She took it from me the night before she died. Miss Marple's voice softened. You're quite sure? Yes. She came to the kitchen late, asked for tea, said she was going to work at her desk. Bramwell let out a scoff. More bedtime melodrama. But Miss Marple's attention was fixed on a new possibility. Lucinda had removed the document from Maisie's safekeeping, perhaps to destroy it, or perhaps to seal it. And then what? Had she given it to Hallam? Or had someone intercepted it before she could? She moved to the fireplace, her eyes scanning the shelves. Something was missing. There used to be a ledger here, she said. The family accounts. Caldwell nodded. Found upstairs, hidden in the red room. And did it contain anything useful? A great deal. Names, dates, payments made, under aliases. It may be the reason Hallam was killed. Miss Marple picked up the envelope that had accompanied the unsigned will. Her fingers paused at the inner flap, where a small corner was torn, neatly, but not recently. She tilted it toward the firelight. This envelope has been opened before, she murmured. But not by Hallam. The tear was resealed, not with glue, but with wax. Sloppy. She looked up. Someone wanted this will to appear recently discovered, but not too official. A balancing. Act A nudged toward Edith, but not so forceful that it would overturn the previous inheritance. Caldwell frowned. You're saying it was planted? I'm saying it was restored, Miss Marple said, from where it was hidden. I suspect Hallam had it for days. But someone knew. Perhaps followed him. Perhaps lured him into thinking Lucinda's changes would lead him to the truth, and then poisoned him to keep that truth from surfacing. Edith's voice cracked. You mean someone killed him over this? She gestured to the paper. Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward Bramwell, who now looked deeply uncomfortable. Perhaps not just this, but it would be a motive. Especially if one expected to lose a fortune. I didn't even know there was another will, Bramwell snapped. No, Miss Marple said calmly, but you did know Hallam was changing something. You argued with him. What? In the garden, 2 days before his death. The groundskeeper heard you. Bramwell's jaw twitched. We disagreed over some land rights. Nothing more. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the sideboard and lifted a framed photo. Lucinda again, her face caught in profile beside a large cedar tree, the same tree outside the study window, and there, in the corner, a barely visible smudge. Wax. Red. She set the frame down. The will was sealed at some point in the study, then hidden again. Perhaps Hallam intended to show it to someone, or perhaps he feared the consequences. Caldwell stepped forward. I'll need to have the handwriting verified. Of course, Miss Marple said, but it won't be the writing that gives us the answer. It will be the intention. Who knew of it? Who stood to lose? The sleet pelted harder against the windows. Bramwell had gone pale. Miss Marple's voice remained quiet. There's another possibility, that Lucinda did sign a version, that Hallam did possess it, and that someone removed that version and replaced it with this. Bramwell's voice was hoarse. Are you accusing me of forgery? No, Miss Marple said gently. I'm accusing someone of murder. The forgery is almost beside the point, but whoever committed the murder had access to both Hallam's briefcase and to Lucinda's study. Maisie's voice, barely above a whisper, cut the tension. Miss Marple, there's something I forgot to say. The night Mr. Hallam died, I saw someone leave the corridor, just before I heard him fall. Miss Marple turned slowly. Who, Maisie? Maisie swallowed. I thought it wasn't important. But it was Mr. Bramwell. I saw him just beyond the hall. He said he'd gone to fetch his book from the library. All eyes turned to Bramwell. He cleared his throat. I did. I told Caldwell that already. He said it didn't matter. Caldwell frowned. You told me you'd been in the lounge. Same thing, Bramwell said weakly. It's all connected. but Miss Marple's expression was unyielding. "No, Mr. Bramwell, the library is not the lounge, and the hall between them leads directly past the study door. If Hallam was already locked in and dying, and if you passed by, then you may have seen who went in. Or you may have gone in yourself." Bramwell's voice rose. "That girl's lying," Maisie flinched. "She's afraid," Miss Marple said calmly. "Not lying, and it's time we listened to her." She crossed to the table and gently lifted the will again. "There is a date," she said softly. "Faint, under the watermark. Pressed in, not written. It matches the day Lucinda died." Caldwell stepped closer. "Invisible ink?" "No," Miss Marple said. "Pressure from the pen. Hallam often signed documents with a hard hand. The impression shows he did sign this, just not in ink." She held the paper toward the firelight, tilting it so the faint indentations shimmered. "It's a ghost signature. But it's there." Caldwell's voice hardened. "Then this was the real will, and someone removed it from Hallam's effects, replaced it with this version, and poisoned him to erase the chain of custody." Miss Marple nodded. "And perhaps they were counting on us believing it was just a draft. Something easily dismissed." Caldwell turned to Bramwell, his voice low and firm. "You'll come with me now?" Bramwell blustered. "You can't. There's no. This is absurd." But he went, and as the door closed behind them, Edith sat slowly on the sofa, staring at the red wax seal. Miss Marple lowered herself beside her and placed a gentle hand on hers. "There is one more thing," she said softly. "The envelope Lucinda took from Maisie. I don't believe she ever gave it to Hallam. I believe she sealed it and hid it somewhere." Edith turned to her, her eyes searching. Miss Marple reached into her coat pocket and produced a brass key, different from the one to the red room. This one bore a faint C on its end. "I found this beneath the third stair of the servants' staircase, wrapped in muslin, and I believe it opens the cedar box in Lucinda's bedroom. The one no one has dared open since her death." She stood slowly. "And I think inside, you'll find what Lucinda wanted most in her final days, to tell the truth." And outside, the sleet began to turn to snow. Chapter 5. The alibi that fell apart at tea. A misplaced teacup and a forgotten phone call unravel a perfect alibi. The fog lay heavy over Fallow Bridge that morning, curling low against stone walls and village hedgerows like a cat that refused to stir. Miss Marple sat in the morning room of Armitage House, watching the mist smudge the landscape to watercolour greys. Inside, the quiet was brittle, a silence threaded with tension, like an embroidered doily drawn too tight. Inspector Caldwell had not returned since Bramwell's arrest the night before, but the house was far from restful. Too many questions still hung in the air, unanswered and restless. The new will had caused an uproar. Bramwell's protestations had grown shriller with every passing hour, and though Edith Vale had inherited more than she'd ever expected, she walked through the corridors with the weight of someone who had just buried another truth. Miss Marple had noticed it even at breakfast. Edith's tea remained untouched, and she had stirred it twice without drinking, as though out of habit or worry. But it was something far more trivial and far more revealing that caught Miss Marple's attention by midday. A single teacup. It had been left on the silver tray in the sitting room, delicate bone china with a thin rim of gold and a pale smear of lipstick on its edge. Rose pink. Not Edith's shade, and certainly not the shade Maisie wore, which was no shade at all. Only 2 women had taken tea in that room yesterday, after Hallam's death. Edith and Lady Frances Pike, a local aristocrat with a fondness for scandal and a tongue sharper than a tailor's shears. Miss Marple had always found Lady Frances fascinating, not because of what she said, but because of what she didn't. Yesterday, Frances had arrived in a swirl of tweed and perfume, all tight smiles and tactful questions, claiming she'd come simply to check on poor Edith, and left just before twilight, saying she had an appointment in Ledbury, but that teacup hadn't been moved, and there was no lipstick stain on either of the cups brought out with the fresh tray an hour later. It meant simply that the teacup had been used much later than Frances had claimed, and someone had failed to remove the evidence. Miss Marple said nothing at first. She simply lifted the teacup, examined the faint smear, and placed it on a linen napkin. She then walked to the telephone cabinet in the hallway, an old oak box with a brass dial, and opened the log book. Maisie kept beside it. The servants were instructed to note all calls made through the village operator, and yesterday's entries were neatly jotted in Maisie's careful hand. There, between a morning call from the butcher and a mid-afternoon message to the post office, was a brief, faint entry. 3:42 p.m. Miss Vale rang Lady Frances Pike. Miss Marple frowned. That did not match Frances's story. She had claimed she had already left by then, had, in fact, declined tea, saying she had only popped in, for a brief moment, and then gone on to her fitting in Ledbury. And yet, if Edith had called her at nearly 3:45, then Frances had not been in Ledbury at all. She had been nearby, possibly even still in the house, and that meant everything about her alibi, the timing, the purpose of her visit, had been a lie. Miss Marple returned to the sitting room just as Edith passed through, pausing at the threshold when she saw the teacup. "Oh," she said, her tone a fraction too careful. "Has Maisie not cleared that yet?" Miss Marple offered a mild smile. "It appears not. I was just wondering, this lipstick, it doesn't seem to be yours." "No," Edith replied, after a beat too long. "That would have been Lady Frances's. She stopped in yesterday." "Yes, I remember," Miss Marple said gently. "She left before tea, didn't she?" "That's right. Around 3:30, Miss Marple nodded. "Curious, because this teacup was never removed, which means she must have stayed longer." Edith's breath caught. I suppose I misremembered." "Easily done," Miss Marple said. "Though Maisie's telephone log shows you called Lady Frances at 3:42 yesterday. That would be rather difficult if she were already gone, wouldn't it?" Edith's face paled, and her hands clasped tightly before her. "I didn't mean to lie, it's just Lady Frances asked me to say she had left early. She didn't want her name dragged into any scandal." Miss Marple's gaze was unwavering. "Did she say why?" There was silence. Then, at last, Edith sat, the fog of hesitation lifting slightly from her voice. "She told me she had come to see Hallam, that she had received a letter from Aunt Lucinda 2 days before her death, warning her about something hidden. Frances thought Hallam might have it, or know where it was. And did she speak with him? She tried, but he refused to see her, locked himself in. She was furious, said he was bluffing, that he'd buried the truth and was waiting to see who came for it." Miss Marple absorbed this with quiet precision. "Did she leave anything behind?" "I don't think so." Miss Marple stood and walked to the wastebasket beside the fireplace. Beneath a bundle of ash and yesterday's Times was a single torn envelope, half burned, its seal melted. She carefully lifted it with the poker and placed it on the hearth. The remaining scrap bore the edge of a family crest and a partial signature. "Says Pike." "She meant to destroy it," Miss Marple murmured, "but something interrupted her. Perhaps Hallam's death. Perhaps the discovery of the second will. Perhaps fear. The question now was whether Lady Frances's visit had any bearing on Hallam's murder, or if it merely unravelled an alibi that someone else had relied on. Miss Marple made her way to the Pike estate later that afternoon. The sleet had resumed, brushing the hedges with silver and soaking her coat as she waited beneath the stone portico. Lady Frances received her in a parlour that smelled faintly of violets and smoke, wearing a maroon wool dress and the expression of a woman who had been expecting a reckoning. "Miss Marple," she said, with a cool smile, "to what do I owe this pleasure?" "I'm afraid I'm following a trail of tea," Miss Marple replied, settling into a rosewood chair. And it led me here. Lady Frances's smile barely wavered. You mean Edith's tea yesterday? Yes. I stopped in. Briefly. Oh, not so briefly, Miss Marple said kindly. The teacup was still there this morning, and the telephone log suggests you were still in the house at 3:42. You claim to have left before then. Lady Frances said nothing. Miss Marple continued. You were seen going upstairs, Lady Frances. Toward the study corridor, just after Hallam entered the study. That was rather bold. The smile broke. I had my reasons. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Lucinda warned you, didn't she? And you thought Hallam had something, perhaps a letter or a document, that could implicate you. I've done nothing wrong. That depends on your definition, Miss Marple said gently, because the unsigned Will Lucinda left favoured both Edith and Maisie. That must have come as a surprise to many. Frances's face flushed, a sudden heat rising in her cheeks. Maisie? That's absurd. She's a servant. Lucinda never did things without meaning, Miss Marple said. Maisie's mother worked for the family before her, served as Lucinda's nurse. There was affection there. Perhaps guilt. Perhaps more. Frances stood. I had nothing to do with Hallam's death. No, Miss Marple said, also rising. But you lied. And lies, Lady Frances, are how the truth gets strangled. She turned to go. Behind her, Frances said, He did have a letter. He waved it at me from the door, said he'd found what Lucinda had hidden, that I'd be wise to confess before it came out. Miss Marple paused. And you didn't try to retrieve it? Frances hesitated. I wanted to, but I was afraid. I left. And he was dead an hour later. Back at Armitage House, night had already begun to fall. The lamps were lit, and a fresh fire crackled in the study. Inspector Caldwell returned just as Miss Marple did, and she relayed everything. Frances's lie, the teacup, the letter. I believe, she said, that Frances was not the murderer, but someone used her visit. Caldwell frowned. Used, yes, to create confusion. She went upstairs, and someone followed shortly after. Someone who knew she'd be remembered, who knew the maid would mention the visit if prompted. And so, when Hallam was found dead, the suspicion could fall on her. But the poison was slow, Caldwell said. Introduced in the tea. Miss Marple nodded. And it was Maisie who brought the tea up, yes? Yes. She said she left it at the door. She did, but someone else could have tampered with it before, or after. She looked toward the hallway, then said, Ask yourself, who had a reason to see Hallam silenced, once and for all? Who stood to lose everything if Lucinda's real? Intentions came to light? It wasn't just Bramwell. And it certainly wasn't Frances Pike. Caldwell leaned in. Then who? Miss Marple's eyes were sharp as a needle's point. Someone we haven't looked at closely enough. She reached into her coat pocket and drew out a letter, one she had discovered tucked into the lining of Hallam's briefcase, folded nearly to invisibility. A single line written in a hasty scrawl. He said the girl knew. I couldn't risk her speaking. Caldwell frowned. What girl? Miss Marple's voice was low. I think we've been underestimating just how much Maisie saw, and just how long she's been holding her tongue. Outside, the fog was returning, wrapping the house in soft grey fingers. And in the servants' corridor, a teacup rattled on its saucer, as if someone's hands had finally begun to tremble. Chapter 6. The Housekeeper's Vanishing Hour. The loyal housekeeper disappears the moment suspicions begin to surface. It was sometime after 7 when the storm rolled in, wind battering the windows of Armitage House with sudden insistence, like fists demanding to be let in. Miss Marple stood in the upstairs hall, a candle flickering in her hand as the electric sconces flickered and died one by one. A fuse gone, no doubt, but it was strange how these things seemed to fail just when the truth was closing in. She had planned to speak with Mrs. Dunsley that evening, quietly and without fuss, But by the time she reached the housekeeper's quarters, the room was empty. No sign of the stiff-laced woman, not a sound in the corridor, not even the faintest hint of lavender oil that always clung to her presence. Her coat was gone from the hook, her boots were missing, and the single tightly wrapped suitcase from under her bed was no longer there. Miss Marple stared at the empty room with calm focus. The housekeeper was gone, and that, she knew instinctively, was not a coincidence. It was an answer. Rain pelted the tall windows as she descended the stairs, her footsteps deliberate. In the drawing room, Inspector Caldwell was waiting, having just returned from Ledbury with a stack of legal documents and a very damp hat. He looked up as she entered and took one glance at her face. "What is it?" "Mrs. Dunsley," she said. "She's vanished." He blinked. Vanished? Gone. Her coat, her suitcase, the spare key to the garden gate, all missing. She left in the last 2 hours and quite without telling a soul. He frowned. No note. Not one. Miss Marple moved to the hearth and stirred the fire back to life with the poker. Though I rather think her disappearance is the note, and a rather eloquent one. Caldwell dropped into the armchair. She's been here 20 years, loyal as the bricks. Loyalty, Miss Marple said mildly, is a complicated thing. Sometimes it binds people to honour. Sometimes it binds them to secrets. He sat forward. You think she was involved in Hallam's murder? I think she knew something. And perhaps, at last, she feared being asked the wrong question. Miss Marple took the poker with her as she crossed the room. On the bookshelf stood a vase of dried lavender, kept there for years by Mrs. Dunsley's own hand. Beside it a small brass box. She opened it. Inside were keys, old ones, mostly rusted, some tagged in the housekeeper's fine, stern hand. But one key was newer, untagged, thin and silver, with the faintest trace of a smear along the teeth. Miss Marple held it to the light. Lipstick. Rose pink. Left in a hurry, she murmured, but not carelessly. She turned back to Caldwell. We must find out where this key fits, and more urgently, where Mrs. Dunsley has gone. There are trains from the village only twice each day, and none at this hour. If she left by foot, someone must have seen her. Caldwell stood. I'll send word to the constable. Check the post office and station master. You check the rest of the house. She nodded, already moving. On the second floor, Miss Marple paused outside Lucinda's bedroom, then opened the door and stepped inside. The storm had snuffed the light from the windows, and the corners of the room were deep with shadow. But she moved confidently, lighting a single candle from the one she carried. Her eyes scanned the wardrobe, the desk, the cedar trunk at the foot of the bed. She knelt, inserted the silver key into the trunk's lock. It clicked smoothly. Inside was not treasure, not ledgers or letters, but a series of carefully bundled objects. Gloves, a faded shawl, and near the bottom, a bundle of old envelopes tied with ribbon. Letters, all addressed in Lucinda Armitage's strong hand, all sealed, all unopened, and each one bore the name George Everley. Miss Marple lifted the topmost one, brushing dust from the edge. The date, 1921. The year after George Everley vanished from his post. They had been written over many years, unsent, never posted, never returned. Love letters, confessions, warnings. She scanned the contents of one. You left more behind than you realize. I have protected her, protected us, but the truth has a way of surfacing, even when buried. I never meant to keep you hidden, but I fear what others would do if they knew you still lived. Miss Marple pressed her lips together. It was no longer a suspicion. George Everley had not died. He had lived, in hiding, protected by Lucinda, and perhaps not far from here. She was halfway through the next letter when she heard it, a sharp knock downstairs, not at the front, the kitchen door. She moved quickly, candle in hand, descending into the back corridor. The wind groaned through the beams, and the house seemed to shrink with the cold. She opened the door. Maisie stood there, soaked and shivering. I followed her," she said breathlessly. "Mrs. Dunsley. I saw her sneak out the garden gate. I thought I should tell you." Miss Marple brought her inside, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "Where did she go, child?" Maisie's voice was small. "The church, then the old gardener's shed. But she wasn't alone. A man was waiting there, tall, old, with a limp." Miss Marple stilled. "Not the groundskeeper?" Maisie shook her head. "No, miss. I've never seen him before. But she gave him something. Papers. And then they both left through the Vicar's Lane. Caldwell burst into the room not 2 minutes. Later, his coat wet, his eyes sharper than ever. "We found her bag near the railway fence, empty, but the porter swears no one boarded a train, and someone saw her with a man." "Then she meant to vanish," Miss Marple said. "And she didn't plan to come back." She handed him the bundle of letters. "We now know why Hallam was killed. He had discovered the truth about George Everley, and perhaps he meant to expose it. But Lucinda protected him for years, and someone, perhaps more than one person, was desperate to silence that story, to preserve a fiction." Caldwell opened one of the letters and swore softly. Miss Marple's voice was calm. "We must find them, Inspector. Not to punish, but to understand. Mrs. Dunsley's loyalty may not have been to Lucinda, or the truth, but to the man she once loved." He looked up. "You think—" "I think she and George Everley were not strangers. I think Lucinda knew, and I think she wrote those letters never to be posted, because they were never meant for London, only for the other side of the estate." Outside, thunder cracked. Somewhere far down the lane, a shadow moved across the hedgerows, 2 figures retreating into darkness, leaving only questions behind. But Miss Marple now had a name, a motive, and a letter bearing the final clue. It was signed in Lucinda's hand. "If anything happens to me, give this to Jane Marple. She will understand what to do." Chapter 7. A page torn from the diary. Miss Marple finds a cryptic reference to the second letter. But where is it? The rain returned just before dusk, hissing against the windows of Armitage House like a whispered warning. It was the kind of weather that made the old floorboards ache and the fireplaces hiss as though they disapproved of the world outside. Miss Marple stood in the late Lucinda Armitage's dressing room, a small wood-panelled chamber that had once been reserved for the rituals of powder and perfume. Now it held only dust, quiet tension, and the faintest trace of rosewater clinging to the back of the velvet drapes. She had come not to pry, but to seek a forgotten truth, something she could feel pressed between the silence and the scent, something still lingering. Earlier that afternoon, while cataloguing Lucinda's effects with Inspector Caldwell and Edith Vale, Miss Marple had noticed a slim green book half-tucked behind the drawer in the secretary desk. It had not been listed in Hallam's inventories nor mentioned by the housekeeper, who was now notably still missing. It was a diary, the kind bound in leather and held closed with a loop of faded ribbon. Lucinda's diary. Miss Marple had read it slowly, respectfully, skimming over the banal domestic reflections and polite village gossip that filled most entries. But in the final week, the tone shifted. The lines became terse, the handwriting more angular, as though written with a shaking hand. One entry stood out, dated the evening before Lucinda's death. "He said he would return for the second letter, but I cannot find it. I know I sealed it, I remember the wax. But now it is not where I left it. If she has it, we're all in danger. Perhaps I was wrong to trust her after all." There was nothing more for that day. The following page, dated the morning of her death, had been torn cleanly from the spine. Miss Marple's fingers paused on the torn edge. No jagged paper, no careless rip. a deliberate tear. Removed by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, she lowered the book into her handbag and stood, eyes sweeping the dressing table. A silver brush, a photograph of Lucinda as a girl, a porcelain swan filled with old hatpins. Nothing new, nothing dangerous. But she had learned long ago that murder often curled itself up into the smallest spaces. She walked down the corridor to Lucinda's private sitting room. The fire had long since gone cold in the grate, and the room smelled of damp, upholstery, and disuse. She knelt by the bookcase. There, nestled between 2 volumes of Trollope, was a slim cloth-bound book with gold embossing. The Life of St. Winifred. A devotional volume, not uncommon. But as she pulled it out, a sheet of paper slipped from its pages and fell to the rug. She picked it up. It was a letter. Folded once, no envelope, sealed only with a dot of wax, red wax the same as the seal on the unsigned will. The wax had been broken. The letter had been read, and it was not addressed to Lucinda but to Edith Vale. Miss Marple opened it carefully. The handwriting was familiar, Lucinda's own, and it read, "You must never let the second letter fall into the wrong hands. If Hallam has seen it, he must be watched. There are names he cannot be allowed to repeat. Even George's safety depends on it. The will was only part of the plan. What I've written in the second letter would destroy more than just an inheritance." Miss Marple exhaled. So it was true. A second letter, written by Lucinda, hidden or stolen just before her death. It explained everything. Hallam's cryptic last words, the sudden panic that followed Lucinda's funeral, Mrs. Dunsley's disappearance, and now, the quiet guilt that seemed to sit perpetually in Edith's posture like a leaden weight. She went immediately to the drawing room, where Edith sat staring at the fire, a book closed in her lap. The girl looked up when Miss Marple entered, but did not speak. "I've come across something," Miss Marple said gently. "A letter from your aunt, addressed to you." Edith's eyes widened slightly, and she held out her hand without a word. But Miss Marple did not surrender it. "Before I give it to you, Edith, I must ask, where is the second letter?" A long silence. Edith's throat moved, but no sound came. "Lucinda believed you had it," Miss Marple continued, "or that you might. Her diary mentions it, but the entry was torn out. She said she feared she'd misplaced it, or that someone had taken it. She wrote that if Hallam had seen it, he was a threat. I believe this letter," she tapped the folded sheet, "was meant to warn you, but someone got to it first." Edith slowly rose to her feet. I never saw another letter, not one that looked important, only the will. And I swear to you, I never read her diary. I didn't even know she kept one." Miss Marple studied her carefully. "And Mrs. Dunsley?" Edith's gaze faltered. "She and Aunt Lucinda had an understanding. I don't know what. But after Aunt died, she became strange, distracted. She watched me constantly. Once I saw her tearing pages from a ledger in the pantry. When I asked what she was doing, she said it was nothing, cleaning up old accounts." Miss Marple handed her the letter at last. "You were meant to see this, but someone wanted to stop you from seeing the rest." Just then, footsteps echoed in the hall. Caldwell, his coat dripping from the rain. "We found someone," he said without preamble. The gardener's boy spotted Mrs. Dunsley near the old canal station. She boarded a bus heading south. "We've sent notice to surrounding villages, but she's gone to ground, vanished." Miss Marple nodded slowly. She knew what the second letter contained, and she knew it pointed to something or someone who could not afford to be exposed. Caldwell sat on the edge of the writing desk, exhausted. "Then what do we do now?" Miss Marple's eyes lit with a quiet certainty. "We find the letter." She stood, already walking toward the servants' corridor. "And I believe I know where to look." They made their way down the narrow stairs to the old linen room. The air was thick with starch and old lavender, and the single bulb flickered overhead. Miss Marple moved to the back where an old sewing machine sat unused, its drawers stuffed with pins, scraps of lace and crumpled instructions. She pulled open the bottom drawer and removed the false base beneath it. There, in a narrow envelope, yellowed and curling, was a folded letter. Lucinda's handwriting again. A different tone, less cautious, more final. To whom it may concern, if this is found, then I have failed to keep the house safe. The truth concerns the night George Everleigh disappeared. He did not betray his country. He uncovered something, within the War Office. Names of men profiting from the chaos. I helped him disappear. I helped him start again. There were others who knew and others who feared the truth. Hallam was one of them. He promised silence, in exchange for protection, but I no longer trusted him. If this letter is read aloud, know that those men still walk among you. George was not a traitor, but those who painted him as one, they still hold power. Lucinda Armitage. Miss Marple stared at it in silence. The room felt colder now. She turned to Caldwell and handed it to him. We've been chasing a murder, but behind it is a greater crime, one that never made the headlines. Lucinda tried to preserve a reputation. Perhaps she should have spoken sooner. But now the truth belongs to Edith. Caldwell was reading it slowly, brows furrowed. If this gets out... It won't, Miss Marple said, not yet. But it mustn't vanish again. Edith stood in the doorway. She had followed them. Her hands were clasped, but her face was still. She was protecting him, she said. All this time? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, and protecting you. Edith stepped forward, took the letter from Caldwell and folded it carefully. Then I'll protect it now. Miss Marple didn't smile, but her gaze softened. As they left the linen room, Miss Marple paused by the servants' shelf. There, half hidden behind a stack of ironing instructions, was a slim date-book. Not Lucinda's. Mrs. Dunsley's. She opened it. On the last page was a single note circled twice. November 11th. Confirm with E. And beneath it, in smaller writing, remove diary page before Jane sees it. Miss Marple closed the book. The storm outside began to pass, but within Armitage House the pressure was only beginning to rise again. Because now they had a name, a letter, and a motive, but they still did not know who E really was. And whoever it was, Lucinda had feared them enough to warn from beyond the grave. Chapter 8. The Secret Hidden in Plain Sight. An innocent embroidery holds the cipher key no one thought to examine. The needle had long since cooled in its thread when Miss Marple came upon the embroidery, forgotten it seemed, though carefully folded, resting at the bottom of a drawer in Lucinda Armitage's sewing cabinet. Rain drummed against the casement window behind her, steady and persistent, like the ticking of a clock that had no intention of stopping. The room was quiet, but, for the occasional groan of the floorboards and the soft creak of the wind pressing at the shutters. She sat perfectly still, the embroidery held lightly in her lap, studying it with an expression not unlike reverence. It was a square of fine linen, pale cream, stitched with floral sprays in rich burgundy and moss green, framed by a border of delicate cross-stitching. At first glance it was simply decorative, a pleasant sampler. But Miss Marple, of course, never trusted first glances. She'd found it, quite by chance while revisiting Lucinda's private sitting room. The room had been combed several times already, by the constable, by Caldwell, even by Edith and Maisie. But Miss Marple, having learned long ago that secrets loved familiarity, had taken it upon herself to examine things others dismissed as ordinary. A tea cosy, a half-used pincushion, a Bible bookmarked not by a verse but a pressed violet petal. And then, the embroidery, folded beneath a set of linens, as if packed away, deliberately. too deliberately. She carried it to the writing table and laid it flat. The design was symmetrical, stylized rose vines curling into an oval with Lucinda's initials stitched at the bottom in dove-grey thread. But there was a peculiar unevenness to one side of the vine, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. A leaf that faced the wrong direction, a tendril that curved awkwardly, a tiny bud shaped like an asterisk rather than a blossom. At first, it appeared to be a flaw, but Miss Marple knew that Lucinda's needlework had always been precise. She had won ribbons for it at the Fallow Bridge Spring Show every year since 1934. No, these deviations were intentional. They weren't flaws. They were clues. She fetched a magnifying glass from Caldwell's kit and returned to the embroidery. Under closer inspection, the pattern revealed more peculiarities. Some of the green thread had been used in unexpected places, forming what now looked not like foliage but letters, curved and stylized, hidden amid the stems and leaves, the faint outline of an H, a slanted A, an L, shorter tucked inside a flower's stem. She sat back in her chair and whispered aloud, "Hallam." The name looped through the vines, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. A message woven into decoration. But if that name was part of a cipher, where was the rest? Miss Marple turned the cloth over. On the reverse side, tiny knots and lines revealed even more curious decisions, thread paths that connected in irregular ways, symbols that resembled dots and slashes. She had seen something like it before, years ago during the war, when a cousin of hers served in code-breaking at Bletchley Park. Embroideries, when done in certain sequences, could serve as rudimentary cipher keys. And now it made sense. Lucinda had hidden something in her letters, something dangerous. Caldwell still believed there were more names, more betrayals buried in the missing documents Lucinda had alluded to in the second letter. But what if the second letter was meaningless without a cipher key? What if Lucinda, careful and methodical to the end, had left the only key in a place no one would think to look? Her embroidery, her pride, her lifelong hobby, wasn't just ornament. It was instruction. Miss Marple refolded the cloth, slid it into her handbag, and crossed the hall toward the study, where Caldwell and Edith were poring over the remaining boxes of Lucinda's papers. The windows shuddered in their frames as the storm outside began to swell. Caldwell looked up. "Find anything?" Miss Marple held up the embroidery. "I think we've been looking for a locked drawer when the key was hidden in the needlework basket all along." Edith frowned. "That? I remember it. Aunt Lucinda started it months ago but never finished. I thought she'd grown tired of it." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "She completed exactly what she meant to. This embroidery is a cipher key. I believe it corresponds to the letters she mentioned in her diary, and perhaps to the names she was afraid to put in plain text." Caldwell sat back slowly. "A code?" "Exactly." Miss Marple spread the embroidery on the desk and pointed. "Each letter is formed subtly, hidden among the vines. Here, Hallam. But there are other anomalies. Dashes of thread, inverted loops. It's a pattern. A substitution cipher, perhaps. Lucinda was clever. She knew this would never be seen as evidence. Caldwell reached for the paper Lucinda had written just before her death, the one retrieved from the linen room behind a false panel. The names there were vague, abbreviated. Only initials, G.E., R.B., D.T. No full identities. But there were accompanying dates. Miss Marple lifted her knitting needle and pointed to the embroidery's border. It had 24 loops, 12 on each side, each one unique. Some had double knots, others single. It wasn't just a border, it was a cipher ring. 24 units, 2 rotations. Perhaps weeks, perhaps individuals. Edith looked down at the cloth and said quietly, "I remember once. Aunt said she didn't trust keeping anything in ink. Ink fades and burns, she told me. Thread survives the fire. I thought she was being poetic." "She was," Miss Marple said. and practical. They spent the next hour decoding the simplest patterns. A set of double-knot stitches in one corner of the embroidery matched the initials in the letter. Caldwell cross-referenced them against Hallam's journal. Entries. One name kept recurring next to various financial records and notes about hush payments. R. Bertram. It was a name neither of them had mentioned before. He wasn't family, not a village name. But one file in Hallam's collection included correspondence signed R.B. Miss Marple read the letter aloud. Continue the payments. If she speaks, all of us fall with her. G.E. is still at large. You were supposed to handle this, Hallam. It wasn't just a threat. It was a warning, a cover-up that extended beyond Armitage House. Miss Marple rose slowly. If Lucinda feared that Hallam would expose her, expose George, then perhaps this R.B. was the one truly pulling the strings, and perhaps it was he who pressured Hallam into silence. Caldwell muttered, or into murder. The wind shrieked past the window, and then the telephone rang. It startled them all. Caldwell answered. A moment later his eyes met Miss Marple's. That was the constable at Westford. The gardener's shed at the old canal. House was found broken into. A cot, food tins, and several burned documents. They believed George Everleigh was hiding there. Miss Marple didn't flinch. Then he was closer than any of us guessed. And there's more, Caldwell said. They found a burned scrap. It bears the name R. Bertram and the edge of an envelope, postmarked 3 days before Lucinda's death. A letter Lucinda may have received, or intended to send, to Bertram. Miss Marple's voice was calm, but cold. Then that is the man we must find. The embroidery gives us his name. The letter gives us his motive. The fire gives us his fear. She turned to Edith, who stood pale and silent. And now, Edith, she said gently, you must tell us what you were too afraid to before. Edith's voice cracked. I saw Mrs. Dunsley with a letter. One night near the kitchen. She was burning something in the stove. I caught the edge of it. It had a seal like a government crest. She said it was nothing. Old receipts. But she looked so frightened. I didn't press. Miss Marple nodded slowly. She knew Bertram. Perhaps she feared him. Perhaps she helped him, thinking she was protecting Lucinda. Or George. And now she's vanished. Caldwell folded the embroidery. We'll circulate his name. Quietly. Discreetly. If he's still watching the house, he'll know we're closing in. Miss Marple glanced back toward the window, where the storm was beginning to ease, the rain falling slower now, more deliberate. Like a watchman tapping the eye glass. One more stitch, she murmured. That's all we need. One more thread to pull. And somewhere beyond the hedges, behind the trees and the fog, someone who had once thought himself safe in shadows was now facing the needlepoint truth. Tomorrow, she knew, would not bring rest, but it would bring Chapter 9. Chapter 9. The garden where no flowers grew. A muddy shoe print leads to the old greenhouse and something long buried beneath it. It was the sort of morning that never truly turned to day, sky smothered in low grey clouds, the air sodden with drizzle that soaked through one's coat, without seeming to fall at all. The grounds of Armitage House were still and sullen, the gravel paths gleaming with wet and the hedges dripping. Yet in that dreary hush, something shifted. Miss Marple noticed it first, standing near the back terrace with her gloved hands folded loosely. She'd been watching the gardener, young Henry, struggle with a wheelbarrow near the rose beds when her eyes were drawn to the southern edge of the property, where the garden met the old orchard. It was there, past the crumbling sundial, and just beyond a line of weeping yews, that the Armitage greenhouse stood. Or rather, leaned. The structure was half collapsed now, its glass panels smeared and broken, its metal frame flaking, with rust. No one had used it in years. Yet, just outside its warped door lay a single clear footprint in the mud. Miss Marple walked slowly across the wet grass, careful not to disturb it. The sole was narrow, the heel pronounced, distinctly a man's shoe, though not heavy work boots. More like town shoes, the kind worn by someone who thought no one would see them walk here. She knelt and studied it. Fresh, likely within the last day. Rain had washed away any other signs of traffic from the night, before. But this had survived. Behind her, Henry looked up. "Something the matter, Ma'am?" She turned slightly. "Tell me, Henry, has anyone used the greenhouse lately?" He frowned, scratched his neck. "Not since I've been here. That place has rats and broken panes. Mr. Hallam once asked me to clean it out, but he never followed up. Truth be told, I thought it'd be pulled down by now." Miss Marple nodded. "And have you seen anyone near it recently? Perhaps yesterday morning?" "No, miss. I haven't been round the south side since Tuesday." He looked toward the trees. "Too waterlogged. Nothing grows out that way anymore. The ground's all wrong." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "That's what I've always found odd." She rose slowly and made her way toward the greenhouse, her boots squelching as she crossed the mossy edge of the path. The door creaked when she pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale with rot and mildew. Wooden seed trays lay cracked and warped on the floor. Dead ivy clung to the beams, and in the center, beneath a patch of broken glass where the sky wept directly onto the earth, lay a wide area of dark, wet soil, loose, freshly turned. Her eyes narrowed. She moved closer, stooped, and pressed the tip of her umbrella into the soft ground. The soil gave easily, too easily. The greenhouse may have been abandoned, but someone had been here recently. And not, she thought, to garden. Footsteps behind her startled her briefly. It was Caldwell. "I thought I might find you here," he said. She gestured to the footprint. "He was here." Caldwell followed her gaze. "Sinclair?" "I believe so, but I don't think he was alone." She stepped back and gestured to the patch of disturbed earth. "This spot was dug recently, likely last night. Rain washed away the tool marks, but the shape of the disturbance remains. It's oval, deep. Not quite a hole, not yet filled." A cache, Caldwell knelt beside it and began to dig with his hands. Miss Marple did not stop him. It took only a minute to uncover the object buried beneath the dirt, a battered metal box, the kind used for army field documents. The clasp was rusted shut, but Caldwell broke it open with his penknife. Inside were several oilskin-wrapped bundles. Letters, all of them. Dozens. Some tied together in ribbon, some in official envelopes with government stamps, some bearing foreign addresses. And one in Lucinda Armitage's unmistakable hand, sealed with red wax and stamped with a foxglove crest. "Miss," Marple inhaled sharply. "The original letter." Caldwell stared at it, stunned. "We thought it was destroyed." "She said she burned it," Miss Marple said, "but she lied. Or rather, she let us believe she had. Edith never saw the full letter. She saw a page. A warning, perhaps. But Lucinda buried the real one." Caldwell pulled out the envelope and slit it open. The contents were brittle with age, the ink slightly blurred, but the writing was legible. Miss Marple read over his shoulder. "To be opened only if my death is sudden or suspicious. George Everleigh did not betray his country. He uncovered corruption within the War Office. The men involved, Sinclair, Bertram, alias Dunley, used their positions to smuggle war contracts to foreign hands in exchange for silence. George learned too much. They planned to discredit him. I helped him disappear." The letter went on, listing account numbers, offshore transactions, and, finally, a name. But the one who frightened me most was not Sinclair. It was the one who sat in my house and smiled at my table, the one who knew how to say nothing better than most people know how to speak, the one who kept Maisie's birth a secret even from herself. It was Hallam. Caldwell looked up. "Hallam?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "He orchestrated George's downfall. Sinclair only returned recently. Hallam was always here." Caldwell stood, wiping his hands. Then Hallam's death wasn't to silence him. It was revenge. Or justice, Miss Marple said, softly. They returned to the manor in silence, the box of letters under Caldwell's arm. Back inside, Edith and Maisie waited in the drawing room, both pale and silent. Miss Marple set the box on the table. "It's over," she said gently. "The truth is no longer buried." Maisie approached the box as if it might bite. That letter, was it really from Lucinda? Miss Marple nodded. She wrote it after George disappeared. She knew too much, but she also knew she couldn't expose it. Not then. So she stitched the cipher, she hid the documents, and she waited. "For someone to finish what she couldn't," Caldwell added. "The authorities will have what they need now. Sinclair won't escape this time. The others will find them." But Maisie wasn't looking at Caldwell. She was looking at the box, at a single ribbon-bound bundle tied in pink thread. "My mother," she whispered. Miss Marple moved to her side. "Lucinda didn't just raise you. She protected you from every shadow that touched this house. That's what this was always about." Edith reached for Maisie's hand. She didn't want you to carry someone else's sins. Outside, the sky began to lighten. The storm had passed, leaving only damp branches and the scent of turned earth. But in the heart of the old greenhouse, in the garden where no flowers had grown for decades, something had bloomed at last. Not roses, not lilies. Truth. And Miss Marple, as always, had been the one to tend it. Chapter 10. The Truth She Wrote in Disguise. Miss Marple deciphers the coded letter and rewrites the entire narrative. The storm had not broken in 2 days. It draped itself heavily over Fallow Bridge, swallowing the moon, muting the birds and pressing against the walls of Armitage House like an accusation. Inside, the clocks ticked louder than they should. The silence between chimes a taut wire strung through every corridor. The truth, Miss Marple knew, was no longer hiding. It was waiting. And that, she had always found, was far more dangerous. She stood alone in Lucinda Armitage's study, lit only by the dim yellow glow of a single desk lamp. Before her sat the letter, unassuming, aged, folded once with precise care. For weeks it had defied every attempt to make sense of it. Hidden in a hollow behind a false back in the cedar chest, it had seemed at first to be nothing more than a confused jumble of Latin phrases, Victorian verse, and sentimental nonsense. But Miss Marple had not spent her life sipping tea and knitting in St. Mary Mead for nothing. She had seen men conceal love affairs in the margins of novels and wives hide bank accounts in hymnal footnotes. When Lucinda had chosen to disguise her truth, she had chosen not just secrecy, but elegance, and she had chosen poetry. The lines were strange on first glance, an Elizabeth Barrett Browning stanza here, a snippet of Tennyson there, but each seemed off somehow. Too stiff in phrasing, too deliberate in punctuation. And then, this morning, Miss Marple had remembered something Lucinda once said at a church bazaar, years ago, while examining a collection of embroidered samplers stitched by schoolgirls. The clever ones hide things in symmetry, but the truly dangerous ones use rhyme. It had been said of needlework, but it applied here. The key was not the words, it was the rhythm. She read it aloud again, slowly, tapping her fingers as she did. To George, I wrote with hands disguised, where brambles grew, the past still lies. The crown of fire, the silent throne, still guards the child he's never known. There were 4 lines. 4 symbols had appeared again and again in the ciphered embroidery now laid on the table beside her. A bramble, a crown, a throne, and a child's silhouette. And the embroidery, she now understood, was not a standalone cipher. It was a Rosetta Stone. She turned the letter over and examined the wax seal that had once been broken. red like the others, but imprinted with a distinct mark. A foxglove blossom. She'd seen it before. Not on Lucinda's stationery, but on a single wall hanging in the upstairs corridor. It had always seemed decorative, an old tapestry sewn in the shape of a heraldic banner. But it wasn't decorative. It was a legend. Miss Marple rose, folded the letter, and left the study. Her shoes made no sound on the carpeted hall. She moved like memory, silent and certain, and paused outside the upper landing, where the foxglove tapestry hung slightly askew. She adjusted it, and behind it, tucked flat against the wallboard, was a thin envelope. Another letter, this one unfinished. She opened it with the same reverent care and read, "To Jane Marple, if you have reached this, then I was not wrong to believe in you. The truth is this: George did not act alone. He discovered the corruption, yes, but he was not the only one to flee. A second name, one I dared not speak aloud, has shadowed me for years. He was the architect. Hallam feared him. I did too. I call him Bertram, but that was never his real name." Her breath caught. "He came here once, said he had come to settle old business. I believe he is still close, watching. There is another ledger hidden where the fire cannot reach it. The cipher is in the stitching, yes, but also in the dates. My embroidery follows the old church calendar. You must begin with Saint Winifred's Day. That was when he first threatened to expose George. I told him if he tried, I would ruin him with what I knew. He laughed. He knew I would never risk the girl. The girl, not Edith. Maisie." The realization struck her with perfect clarity. Lucinda had left the housekeeper a portion of her estate, yes, but she had also protected Maisie fiercely, even when it made no sense to do so. Even when it seemed irrational, she had treated the girl like family, because she was. Miss Marple returned to the study, letter in hand, and opened the embroidery once more. St. Winifred's Day, November 3rd. The stitches along the border were arranged not randomly, but as dates. She traced from November 3rd onward, following the symbols hidden among the threads: a crown, a serpent, a black dog, and finally, 3 dots. Morse. She leaned closer, underneath the left rosebud stitched in crimson silk so deep it barely contrasted the linen, with the faintest dashes, long, short, short. D, and then beside it, long, short. A, then 3 dots. S, D, A, S, initials. D, A, S, Dorian Alexander. Sinclair. The quiet man who ran the London Antiquities Trust. A name Edith had once mentioned in passing, Lucinda's old acquaintance. A man who had visited the house 2 months before Lucinda's death, claiming to be researching family history. But no one had ever confirmed it. No one had even asked why he came. Miss Marple sat perfectly still. The entire narrative shifted. Hallam had not been acting on fear alone. He had been blackmailed. By Sinclair. Bertram, as Lucinda called him, had used the ledger to control those involved in the cover-up of George Everleigh's disappearance. But he had also come back for something more. Maisie. Lucinda had kept the truth of the girl's birth hidden even from Maisie herself. But the ciphered embroidery and the letter's references made it clear now. Maisie was George Everleigh's daughter, born in secret, raised by Lucinda under the guise of loyalty to the maid's mother, protected with relentless precision. Miss Marple breathed deeply and stood. She rang for Caldwell. He arrived within moments, mud still on his coat from the field behind the chapel, his face pinched with fatigue. She handed him the letter and the embroidery. "It's Sinclair," she said. "He was behind it all. He manipulated Hallam, perhaps even aided Lucinda in the early years, but later used the ledger to extort her silence. When Hallam threatened to reveal what he knew, when he began to regret his part, Sinclair struck." Caldwell read quickly, lips tightening. "And Maisie?" "She's the child Lucinda mentions, the one George never knew. Lucinda raised her here, under a false name, hiding the truth from everyone, including Maisie. But Sinclair knew. He must have learned it years ago. Perhaps from George himself, or a letter intercepted. That's why Lucinda wrote the coded warnings. That's why she embroidered the cipher. She knew words would be burned. But thread survives the fire. Caldwell looked up. Where is Sinclair now? Miss Marple's voice was crisp. He sent a wire to the house yesterday. I found it in the waste bin. He'll be arriving tomorrow. No reason given. But he's coming to collect something or someone. Caldwell stood. Then we'll be ready. But Miss Marple shook her head. No, she said quietly. He must not know we're ready. He must believe the game is still his. The storm had stilled by morning. The clouds broke just enough to paint the countryside in a pale, uncertain light. Armitage House stood silent, as it had done for centuries, holding its truths with elegant stubbornness. But this time Miss Marple stood before the hearth with a fire kindling not of smoke, but revelation. And as she watched Sinclair's automobile wind up the lane toward the gates, she turned to Caldwell and whispered, "The truth she wrote in disguise has now become the truth he cannot hide." What came next would not be simple, but the embroidery had spoken, the ledger had endured, and Miss Marple, armed with thread and letters and the knowledge of secrets long buried, was ready for the final chapters. Chapter 11. The murderer who sat beside her all along. The village gasps. Only Miss Marple had seen through the perfect mask. The downpour began again just as the church bells rang 7. Rain slipped from the gutters of the old stone cottages in Fallow Bridge like tears. Most of the villagers had taken shelter after dusk, but light still glowed from the vicarage, from the Rose and Crown pub, and from Armitage House, the grand, brooding estate, now more tangled in secrets than ivy. Inside the drawing room, a fire burned too hot for the season, crackling like a nervous laugh. Miss Marple sat in her usual chair, her knitting untouched in her lap, her eyes fixed calmly on the man opposite her. Dorian Alexander Sinclair. He was every inch the gentleman. Silver hair swept neatly back, a dark wool suit tailored impeccably, and a manner so charming it could polish a lie into a proverb. No one in the room, certainly not the village women who had poured his tea earlier, could have guessed the weight of what sat behind those well-mannered eyes. But Miss Marple knew, and she had known for some time. Edith Vale sat beside Miss Marple, silent, her hands knotted tightly. On the other side of the hearth, Inspector Caldwell leaned on the mantel, unreadable. Maisie was not present. She had been sent to the vicarage earlier, under the guise of keeping warm, away from the house, away from danger. Miss Marple had insisted on that. Sinclair smiled faintly. "I must admit, Miss Marple, you have the advantage. Everyone seems so tense this evening. Almost funereal." "Perhaps because we've seen enough death lately," Miss Marple replied softly. "And some of us have grown weary of funerals we cannot explain." "Oh?" "But I thought everything had been explained. Lucinda's will, Hallam's unfortunate accident, the missing housekeeper still unaccounted for, of course, but one can't expect neat endings in real life." "No," said Miss Marple, her voice gentle as ever. "Real life is rarely neat. But truth, Mr. Sinclair, truth is extraordinarily tidy when it is finally uncovered." He tilted his head, amused. "And you believe you've uncovered it?" "I do." She met his gaze without flinching. "You see, I've always believed that murderers are not monsters. They're actors. And the best ones learn not to hide in shadows but to stand in the light. They smile kindly. They know how to pass a cup of tea just so. They sit beside us and make us feel quite safe." A flicker passed through Sinclair's eyes. Caldwell stepped forward. "Perhaps you'd like to explain what you mean, Miss Marple." She nodded, folding her hands. "When I first met Mr. Sinclair, I was told he was a friend of Lucinda's, a distant cousin through marriage, here on matters of family research. But I found that odd, as Lucinda never mentioned him. And Lucinda, for all her secrets, was not careless with names. I began to watch him. Not his words, but his habits. He walked the halls like he belonged here. He touched the balustrade as though he'd measured it himself. And he spoke of George Everleigh not as a traitor or a myth, but as a mistake. That choice of words struck me. Edith's voice was quiet. A mistake? Yes, said Miss Marple. Sinclair said once, it was all a terrible mistake, not tragedy, not injustice, and certainly not betrayal. He was too close to it. Caldwell narrowed his eyes. You're saying Sinclair wasn't an observer, he was involved? Deeply, Miss Marple said. In fact, he was the one who began it. The man Lucinda feared most. The one Hallam called Bertram in his final records. Bertram was a mask, a code name. But behind it was always Sinclair. Sinclair's jaw twitched. You're making dangerous accusations, Miss Marple. She stood, walking slowly to the writing desk. Not accusations, revelations. You see, Lucinda didn't trust ink. She trusted thread. Her embroidery cipher pointed to DAS, your initials. Her letter, hidden behind the foxglove tapestry, warned that you would return to settle old business. And just this morning, the final page of Mrs. Dunsley's datebook was recovered. In it, an entry circled in red. Dorian to arrive. Must keep her quiet. Sinclair remained seated. The fire snapped between them. Miss Marple looked at him with something like sorrow. You killed Hallam. He did not deny it. Caldwell stepped forward, tense. Is that true? Sinclair let out a breath, almost a laugh. He was going to expose us all. Do you know what that ledger would have done? Names, connections, all of it tied to the War Office. We buried that once. George was a fool for unearthing it. Hallam wanted absolution. And Lucinda was going to give it to him. You poisoned him, Miss Marple said. He poured his own tea, Sinclair said mildly. I merely sweetened it beforehand. And Lucinda? Edith's voice was hoarse. Did you kill her too? Sinclair turned to her softly. Lucinda was always a problem. Clever, loyal, dangerous. But I didn't have to kill her. She did it to herself. She sent the letter, and then the guilt took root. Her heart gave out. I watched it happen. I didn't even have to lift a finger. You watched her die? Edith whispered. Yes, Sinclair said, because she had betrayed me. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her gaze unwavering. The tragedy, of course, is that Lucinda's betrayal was never yours to punish. You had no right to decide who lived or died. She was protecting a criminal, Sinclair said sharply. George, Everleigh should have hanged. She hid him. She kept him breathing while good men died. Miss Marple's voice hardened. George Everleigh uncovered corruption, and he was punished for it. Lucinda kept him alive not to shield him, but to give hope to a girl who never knew her father. You tried to erase a truth that didn't belong to you. A long silence fell. Then Caldwell stepped forward. Mr. Sinclair, you'll come with me. But Sinclair didn't move. You'll never prove it, he said quietly. There's no paper with my name, no weapon, no witness. No, Miss Marple said, but there is one thing. She reached into her knitting bag and withdrew a small silver locket. I found this hidden in the lining of Lucinda's jewellery box. Inside, a miniature portrait of George and a photograph of Maisie as a baby. The reverse is engraved. For our daughter when the truth is safe. She placed the locket on the table before him. And that time, she said, is now. Sinclair stared at the locket, and for the first time the polish on his charm cracked. His hands clenched. He did not speak again. Outside the rain slowed. Inside the room seemed to exhale. Miss Marple turned to Edith. Sometimes we think the villain is the stranger in the fog, but more often he's the man pouring our tea. the one who smiles too easily, who always seems to know when to arrive. She picked up her knitting, finally placing a stitch, and in the distance a church bell rang once. One more chapter remained. One more. Thread to pull. Chapter 12. The confession that burned the letter. The killer finally confesses, but the reason they destroyed the original letter shocks everyone. The rain had stopped sometime after midnight, leaving Armitage House wrapped in the thick hush of a world that had exhaled at last. The roads glittered with dampness, and the wind had died to a soft murmur threading through the trees. But within the manor, silence had a different shape, tense, pregnant, waiting to become something else. In the drawing room, the fire had burned low, casting long amber shadows along the walls. The armchairs stood empty now, their floral upholstery faintly scorched by the weight of secrets finally exposed. Miss Marple stood by the window, her hands folded lightly, her expression unreadable. Inspector Caldwell paced slowly by the hearth, boots clicking on the tile in a rhythmic measure of thought. They had taken Sinclair away hours ago. The man's composure had cracked in the end, not with a violent outburst or a declaration, but with a single wordless glance toward the locket Miss Marple had shown him. It had undone everything. He had not denied the murders, nor his role in the cover-up of George Everleigh's disappearance. But one thing remained unsolved. One letter still missing, the letter Lucinda had written in her own hand, which had held the final truth. The names, the motive, the one she had called the second letter. And now it was gone. Burned. Someone else had destroyed it. Miss Marple had suspected this from the beginning. Lucinda would never have allowed that letter to go unguarded. She had written it knowing she might not survive. She had stitched it into her embroidery, hinted at it in the diary, and yet the physical letter had vanished before anyone could read it in full. It had been someone close, someone who knew where to look, someone who still hadn't left the house. A soft knock at the door broke the stillness. Edith Vale stepped inside. Her face was pale, her expression raw, not the cool reserve she had worn for weeks, but something quieter, stripped down. "I suppose you know," she said. Miss Marple turned. "I know you burned it." "Yes." Edith nodded once, her arms folding around herself, as if bracing against something that might collapse inward. "It was the night after Aunt Lucinda died. I found it in the cedar chest. It had fallen behind the false bottom. I didn't mean to snoop, but she never let me touch her private drawer. And when she was gone, I thought..." Caldwell stepped forward. "Why not bring it to us?" Edith glanced at him, but then looked only at Miss Marple. "Because I read it." The fire popped softly behind them. "I read every word," she whispered. "It named names, not just Sinclair, not just Hallam. It spoke of a network, powerful men, officials, men in Parliament, men who had let George Everleigh take the fall to protect their interests. Aunt Lucinda had found proof, letters, account ledgers, even war dispatches. She had kept copies. And she sent them to people, reporters, even an MP. She had waited decades to do it. Miss Marple's voice was low. "And you were afraid of what would happen." "I wasn't afraid for myself," Edith said. "I was afraid for Maisie." The name lingered in the room like smoke. "I didn't know at first," Edith continued, "but Aunt Lucinda confessed it in the letter. That Maisie was George's daughter, that she had helped raise her to protect her from what he'd been accused of. But if the world knew, if everything Lucinda wrote got out, Maisie wouldn't be seen as innocent. She'd be the daughter of a traitor, a symbol, a weapon in someone else's hands." Miss Marple said nothing. She let the silence hold space for the truth to expand. Edith's shoulders shook once, but she remained composed. "I took the letter to the garden. It was raining then. I remember holding it in both hands, trying to decide if I could tear it in half. But I couldn't. So I lit it, watched it curl and darken, The ink went first. Her handwriting disappeared into ash. "And you said nothing," Caldwell said quietly. "What was there to say?" Edith's voice caught. "If I had spoken up, Sinclair would still have gotten what he wanted. He would have twisted it, found a way to erase George again. I thought if we just kept quiet, maybe the rest would fade." "But truth doesn't fade," Miss Marple said. "It waits." Edith finally looked at her. "Is she safe now, Maisie?" Miss Marple nodded. "Safer than she's ever been. Sinclair's influence is broken. The embroidery, the diary, and the duplicate ledger pages you didn't know Lucinda had hidden, those will be enough. We don't need the letter anymore." Edith closed her eyes. "I just didn't want her to grow up believing that everything about her life was scandal. I wanted her to have peace." Miss Marple moved closer and gently took Edith's hand. "She will, because you made a sacrifice. You protected her, not by silence, but by choosing which truth to tell, and when." Caldwell looked between them. "We'll need a statement." Edith nodded, calm now. "You'll have it." She turned and left the room without further word, leaving the two of them alone again in the soft, warm silence. Caldwell exhaled. "Do you think she did the right thing?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "I think Lucinda would have understood." She moved to the window and looked out. The mist was lifting now, curling off the fields like ribbon unspooling from an old letter. In the distance, the bell at the vicarage chimed for the morning service. The first light spread over the village rooftops, glinting in the puddles like the past winking at the future. Miss Marple thought of the first letter, sealed in wax, arriving too late to save Lucinda, and of the second, written in trembling hands, burned in a garden to save someone not yet ready for the world to know everything. Truth, she had always believed, was a patient thing, and sometimes it dressed in disguise, not to deceive, but to protect. She stepped away from the window and said softly, "It's time." Caldwell looked at her. "For what?" She smiled faintly. "For chapter 13.